8 in the evening, at a small non-profit animal shelter on the edge of the city, the front light still burning long after closing. A veterinarian in blood-stained scrubs bent over a surgical table finishing an emergency operation on a dog that had been struck by a car barely an hour earlier. A patrol car eases into the gravel parking lot outside, headlights sweeping across the darkened windows. Within only a few minutes, that same veterinarian is being questioned like a common suspect, openly mocked for daring to claim he's a doctor, and ordered in no uncertain terms to step away from the animal still lying anesthetized and open on his table, and the shelter's quiet owner, standing motionless in the doorway of the cramped surgical room, is recording every single second of it on her phone. This is the story of a public humiliation that unfolded in the middle of a genuine life-or-death surgery. An officer whose contempt was captured in unmistakable detail from start to finish, and the unassuming shelter owner whose steady, silent recording turned an ugly, deniable moment into undeniable, irrefutable proof. Dr. Elias Turner had been a practicing veterinarian for 14 years, the last 6 of them quietly volunteering as evenings and weekends at a struggling, chronically underfunded non-profit animal shelter on the outskirts of the city, work he accepted no payment whatsoever for, and rarely so much as mentioned to anyone who didn't already know. He ran a modest private practice during his regular daytime hours, but it was the unpaid shelter work that he privately considered the truest and most honest expression of why he had become a veterinarian in the first place. The desperate emergency cases that arrived without warning, the injured strays that no one else in the city would agree to treat, the animals that showed up broken and terrified with no money behind them at all, nothing but the shelter's painfully thin resources and Elias's own stubborn willingness to stay late in de-entered. He'd grown up with a deep, uncomplicated, lifelong love of animals and a father who had taught him, patiently and by example, that the truest measure of any person was precisely how they chose to treat the creatures and the people who could do absolutely nothing for them in return. Elias had built his entire life and career around that one quiet principle, and the shelter, perpetually underfunded and endlessly overwhelmed with more need than it could ever fully meet, was the place where he lived that principle out most completely and most fully, performing delicate surgeries in a cramped back room on aging equipment held together largely by donations, borrowed parts, and sheer ingenuity, saving animals that would have had no realistic chance of survival anywhere else in the city. His father, who had passed a few years earlier, had never fully understood the specifics of the medicine, but he had understood the impulse behind it perfectly, and Elias often thought of him during the long, quiet, late-night hours at the shelter, hands deep in the difficult work of saving something small and voiceless that the rest of the world had already given up on or driven past without a second glance. It was work that asked everything and returned very little that could be measured, and Elias had never once regretted a single hour of it, which was exactly why the events of that particular evening would cut so much deeper than the simple indignity of them alone might suggest. That particular evening, a dog had been carried in through the front door by a shaken Good Samaritan who had found it struck by a car on a dark road nearby, badly injured, bleeding heavily and barely conscious, and Elias had scrubbed in for emergency surgery within only a few minutes of its frantic arrival. He was already deep into the delicate procedure, the dog stabilized but still fully under anesthesia on his surgical table, when the shelter's unusual after-hours lights and the visible movement inside a building that any passerby would have assumed was long since closed for the night drew the attention of a patrol car rolling slowly past on the road outside. The area immediately around the shelter had seen a handful of recent reported break-ins at several nearby businesses after dark, and a patrol officer, noticing lights burning and movement inside a non-profit that he simply assumed would be closed and empty at that hour of the evening, decided on his own initiative to investigate what he had already half decided was suspicious after-hours activity worth interrupting. Officer Craig Bowman, 7 years into the job, entered through the shelter's unlocked front door without announcing himself, and made his way back through the dim, quiet building toward the single lit back room, where he found Elias standing in blood-flecked surgical scrubs, gloved and masked, bent in concentration over an anesthetized dog stretched out on a surgical table under a bright overhead lamp. Rather than immediately recognizing the entirely obvious and unmistakable reality directly in front of him, a working veterinarian in the middle of surgery in a plainly medical setting. Bowman's suspicion, already primed by the recent break-in reports and steered further by his own quiet, unexamined assumptions, instead framed the whole scene as something strange and threatening that required immediate, aggressive interrogation. "Step away from that table. What exactly are you doing in here?" Bowman's voice carried loudly into the small surgical room, sharp, hard, and openly demanding. Elias didn't so much as glance up from the animal beneath his hands. "I'm a veterinarian. I'm in the middle of emergency surgery right now. This dog was hit by a car about an hour ago. I genuinely cannot step away from this table without risking its life. A veterinarian." Bowman's tone practically dripped with open, undisguised skepticism. A faint but unmistakable mocking edge already creeping into the word itself. "In here, this time of night, covered head to toe in blood. Right, sure you are. I'm going to need you to step back from whatever it is you're actually doing. Officer, I'm a fully licensed veterinarian, and this animal is currently under general anesthesia," Elias said, keeping his voice deliberately steady and low, his gloved hands never once leaving the open surgical field in front of him. His focus split carefully and precariously between the intruding officer and the fragile life on the table, depending entirely on his continued, uninterrupted attention. "If I stop what I'm doing right now, this dog will very likely die." "You seriously expect me to believe some guy standing in a back room with a blade over an animal at 8 o'clock at night is a real doctor?" Bowman's mockery sharpened noticeably, his contempt now entirely unmistakable, one hand gesturing dismissively at the entire scene as though the very suggestion of it were transparently absurd on its face. "I don't expect you to believe anything at all, officer. What I expect is for you to let me finish saving this animal's life, and then I will gladly answer any single question you have for me." Elias's voice remained outwardly calm, but a distinct edge of genuine, mounting urgency had entered it now, impossible to fully mask. "My veterinary license is sitting in my bag in the corner of this room. The shelter's owner is here in the building right now and can confirm every word I'm telling you, but I cannot, under any circumstances, stop this surgery in the middle. You'll stop the second I tell you to stop." Bowman stepped further into the cramped room, his earlier mockery now hardening into something considerably more aggressive and immediate. "Put those instruments down and step away from that table. I won't tell you again. If I put these instruments down right now, in this exact moment, this dog dies on this table. That's not a threat or an excuse. It's simply the truth of where we are in this procedure." Elias's voice froze for the very first time, not in anger, but in something closer to sheer disbelief, that he was genuinely being ordered to abandon a living patient mid-surgery. "I'm not going to let that happen simply because you have decided, looking at me, that I don't match what you think a doctor is supposed to look like." And it was at exactly this point that the shelter's owner, a quiet, watchful woman named Diane, who ran the small non-profit and had personally unlocked the door to let Elias in that evening, stepped fully and deliberately into the open doorway of the surgical room, her phone already raised and held perfectly steady in both hands, having in fact been quietly recording the entire exchange from the very moment tone had first curdled into mockery. "Officer, I am the owner of this shelter," Diane said, her voice calm, level, and utterly unhurried. Her phone held plainly visible and rock-steady in front of her. "This man is Dr. Elias Turner. He is a fully licensed veterinarian who volunteers his own time here, and he is right now, at this moment, performing emergency surgery on a dog that will die if he stops to answer you. And I want you to know that I have been recording this entire conversation from the beginning." Bowman's whole posture shifted visibly at the sudden sight of the raised phone, his aggression faltering and stumbling, though his stubborn skepticism hadn't quite fully broken yet. You're recording me right now." "Every single word of it," Diane confirmed evenly, without a trace of hesitation or apology, including the part just now where you openly mocked a doctor for being a doctor, while he's standing there with his hands inside a dying animal trying to save its life. "So now I would very strongly suggest you let the man finish his work, and once he has, he'll be more than happy to show you his license." The simple, undeniable presence of the camera combined with the flat, unshakable certainty in Diane's quiet voice, accomplished in a single moment what all of Elias's own patient, repeated explanations somehow hadn't managed to accomplish at all. It made Bowman genuinely pause, the sudden sinking awareness that his own conduct was being carefully documented in real time, cutting cleanly through the contempt that had driven the entire encounter up to that point. Elias, refusing now to be drawn even 1 inch further into the confrontation behind him, turned his full and complete attention back to the dog on his table, working steadily and methodically through the remainder of the delicate procedure, while Bowman stood uncertainly near the doorway, his earlier certainty visibly and steadily eroding under both Diane's unwavering recording and the increasingly undeniable reality of what he had actually blundered into. The small surgical room, only moments earlier the site of a rapidly escalating and ugly confrontation, settled instead into a tense, watchful quiet, broken only by the quiet, focused sounds of Elias's careful work and the soft, rhythmic beeping of the anesthesia monitor beside the table. It took nearly 20 more painstaking minutes, but Elias eventually closed the very last suture and fully stabilized the dog, finally stepping back from the surgical table only once the animal's vital signs had settled reliably into a safe, steady range. And only then, with his patient genuinely out of immediate danger, did he at last peel off his blood-flecked gloves, walk calmly to the corner of the room, retrieve his veterinary license from his bag, and hold it out toward Bowman without a single word of comment. Bowman took the license and examined it in silence, the full crushing weight of the situation now finally landing on him all at once, a fully licensed, practicing veterinarian, caught in the middle of a genuine emergency surgery, whom he had interrupted, openly mocked, and repeatedly ordered to step away from a dying animal, and every last second of it recorded in clear, unbroken detail. I apologize, Bowman said finally, the mockery now entirely and completely drained from his voice, replaced instead by an uncomfortable, dawning awareness of exactly how badly the entire encounter had gone and exactly how thoroughly and permanently it had all been documented. I saw the lights on and I thought, you thought a black man standing in a back room couldn't possibly be the doctor he calmly told you more than once that he was, Elias said, his voice quiet now but carrying an unmistakable, settled weight beneath the calm. You mocked me while I had my hands inside a dying animal on that table. And if I'd actually listened to you, if I had done what you ordered and stepped away when you told me to, this dog would be dead on this table right now instead of breathing. I'd like your name and your badge number, please. Bowman provided the information, his discomfort now plainly written across his entire face, and left the shelter not long after, the encounter itself over and done with, but preserved permanently and in full on Diane's phone. Diane didn't hesitate for even a moment about what needed to be done with the recording she'd captured. The footage, a uniformed officer openly mocking a veterinarian in the middle of surgery, ordering him repeatedly to abandon a dying animal and dismissing his stated credentials with plain, undisguised contempt, was exactly the sort of thing that, once shared publicly, would prove utterly impossible to explain away or quietly walk back, and she felt a genuine, immediate obligation to make certain that Elias's dignity and the very real near-catastrophe the officer had so nearly caused didn't simply vanish into silence the way she suspected such things usually did. She shared the footage first with a local animal welfare organization she'd worked closely alongside for years, an organization that grasped its significance almost instantly, and within only a few days the recording had spread well beyond the shelter's small, tight-knit community of volunteers and donors. The stark image of an unpaid volunteer of emergency surgery, striking a deep and immediate nerve with animal lovers and medical professionals alike across the region. Elias, for his own part, remained characteristically far more focused on the recovering dog's daily progress than on any of the rapidly growing public attention swirling around the incident, checking in on his patient every single day as it slowly healed, though he did quietly acknowledge, when he was directly asked about it, that the encounter had genuinely shaken him in a way that very few things across his 14-year career ever had. Not the mockery itself, which he had unfortunately shortly officer's 14-year career ever had. Not the mockers. Where it's kind of snap I might in the will so close. The police department's internal review examined Officer Bowman's own body camera footage alongside Diane's steady recording, the two independent sources together capturing the entire encounter in complete, unbroken detail from beginning to end. Elias's repeated, patient, entirely calm explanations, his principled refusal to abandon a living patient mid-surgery, and Bowman's steadily escalating mockery and open contempt throughout the whole confrontation. In his own interview with investigators, Bowman visibly struggled to mount any real defense of his conduct, the plain existence of the recording leaving very little room for any justification he might have attempted. "I didn't believe him when he told me he was a vet," he admitted plainly. "And I let that one assumption color absolutely everything that came after it. And I said things to that man that I never should have said." The lead investigator noted pointedly in the final report that Bowman's conduct went well beyond a simple, ordinary failure to properly verify someone's identity. His open, repeated mockery of Elias's stated credentials, combined with his insistence that Elias physically abandon an animal lying open under anesthesia, together represented not merely poor professional judgment, but a genuine contempt that had very nearly directly caused the death of the very animal the entire shelter existed to detritus innatus. Officer Bowman received a formal disciplinary suspension and was required to complete additional training, focused on both verification procedures and basic professional conduct, the department's written review specifically citing his mocking treatment of a licensed professional and his repeated demand that a veterinarian abandon a patient in the middle of surgery as serious and unacceptable lapses in both judgment and basic human decency. The department additionally issued broader guidance reminding its officers that a clearly medical or professional setting and the plain presence of someone actively and visibly engaged in medical work warranted careful verification and patience rather than immediate assumption and contempt. Elias, entirely in character, chose not to pursue a personal lawsuit of any kind, directing his energy instead toward the shelter itself, where the significant public attention the incident had unexpectedly drawn translated, somewhat to everyone's genuine surprise, into a sudden and sustained surge of donations that finally allowed the chronically underfunded little non-profit to upgrade its aging, failing surgical equipment for the first time in well over a decade. He often remarked afterward with his characteristic dry wryness that the very dog he had fought so hard to keep alive on that table that night had, in its own strange and roundabout way, ended up helping to fund genuinely better care for every single animal that came through the shelter's doors after it. The dog itself recovered fully and completely and was adopted several weeks later by the very same shaken Good Samaritan who had first carried it in through the door that night, a small, quiet, deeply satisfying ending that mattered to Elias far more than any of the attention the incident had generated ever could. He continued volunteering his evenings and weekends at the shelter exactly as he always had, performing the same difficult emergency surgeries in the same cramped back room, though Diane made a quiet point of ensuring the shelter's front door stayed securely locked during all after-hours procedures from that night forward. A small, practical precaution born directly out of a night that neither of them would ever fully forget. Diane, whose simple, steady recording had preserved the entire truth of what happened when it might so easily have been lost, became something of a quiet, unassuming advocate afterward for the plain, underestimated power of documentation, often gently noting to anyone who asked that she had done nothing more remarkable that night than hold up a phone and simply refuse to look away, and that it had made all the difference in the world between an ugly private incident that would have quietly vanished and one that actually led to genuine accountability. This story is a reminder that even a person caught in the middle of the most obvious, undeniable, selfless act of care imaginable can still be met with pure contempt and suspicion by someone who has already decided in advance exactly what they think they're looking at, and that sometimes the only thing standing between a quiet injustice and real accountability is a single steady hand holding up a camera, quietly and stubbornly, refusing to look away. If this story moved you, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe for more true stories of justice finally catching up.